Welcome, everyone. My name is Nivas, and this is COP383, Achieving Governance at Scale. I'm part of our worldwide cloud governance team, and we provide content as well as guide our customers on using our governance services.
My name is Andrew Blackham. I'm a product manager from the team behind AWS Organizations. I've been on the team for the last 4 years. And we're super excited to have with us a customer that can talk to us about their governance best practices. Please go and introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, my name is Colin Usher. I'm based out of Dublin, Ireland. I am a senior manager in cybersecurity engineering with Workday.
Awesome. Thank you. So we run a similar session every year, which covers the best practices as well as the guidance on how to use our services. But every year, this session is different. Governance is critical to all of our organizations, but the approaches to governance changes. So as we continue to release new features and capabilities, it impacts our best practices. And then we also learn from our customers on how to improve our guidance. And so that's what this session is all about. It's about the foundations for cloud governance and how we can incorporate some of the latest features and capabilities of our governance services. Our agenda, we're going to talk about the core elements of governance, and then we'll talk about the multi-account integrations. A lot of governance is around AWS Organizations, the multi-account environment, and integrating it with a number of AWS services to achieve your governance objectives. And then we're really glad to have Colin share with us the governance story with Workday. So I'll start with just laying out like the baseline definition for cloud governance. Governance as a definition is very broad, has a lot of different perspectives depending on who you talk to. For some, it's boardroom governance. For others, it's corporate governance. And I tried to, just this morning, I was actually talking to the taxi cab driver. He asked me what session I was going to deliver. I told him governance and compliance. He, unfortunately, thought I was going to talk about governments. And so you can see immediately, we need to be specific about what we're talking about. And AWS has its own definition for cloud governance. It's about the rules, the processes, and reports that allow you to implement best practices according to governance. And I would also like to add that according to the customer's business objectives. So if you take a look at the QR code over here, it will actually take you to our cloud governance website that just gives you a good overview of governance services. The use cases for governance. We have 3 major ones: regulation, operations, and management. With regulation, I'm sure that everyone here comes in from different industries, possibly different verticals, and even geos. What this then means is that we have different security frameworks. You might be dealing with PCI compliance, HIPAA compliance, or maybe, depending on the geo, their own specific security framework. Second, it's operations. You might be running mergers and acquisitions. You might be trying to bring in another environment into your existing target environment. Or you might be trying to figure out how to improve the velocity and agility of your development teams. Maybe that's through building well-architected configurations or monitoring or bringing some visibility into what your teams are doing. And then on management, it's about cost optimization, introducing some efficiency, and you can only do that unless you have a good understanding of what resources are running within your multi-account environment. And that's where our governance services help with. And I would also like to talk about the scale, just to give you guys a glimpse of the scale that the governance services are operating on. With AWS Organizations, the typical customer environment runs anywhere from tens to hundreds and maybe even thousands of accounts. But AWS Organizations actually manages millions of accounts for our customers. And then identity and access management. We can see here that it handles over 1 billion API calls, and that's per second. If you think about some of our topmost websites, they're only handling millions of visits per month. So that just gives you a good analogy of how to compare the scale and the efficiency that these services provide. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Andrew to talk about some of our elements.
So I talk to the customers a lot about their environments that they are managing and where they're trying to build governance in place. And I always have to start with a baseline level understanding of what your structure looks like and what the key elements are for your environment where you're building your governance best practices. And I always have to start with these basic principles because to this day, I still get customers, large customers, legacy customers who've been on AWS for a long time, and they come to me and they say, hey, I have one big account that everybody is in, and I really need to think about how I can break this out into different accounts. I know we all sort of started there probably back in the day, depending on when you started with an AWS. But the key elements of scaling is building that structure in place, and it's usually not in a single account, it's usually in multiple accounts. But the easiest way that I can think about the structure that you're building that makes sense to me, and that usually makes sense to others as well, is you have to think about your environment as a building. And there's some elements that you have to put in that building for it to make sense, for you to manage it effectively. So there's rooms that when you go to a building, there's typically different rooms for different purposes. You have a blueprint or a structure in place. You want to know where your rooms are supposed to go and what they're used for. And then, of course, you want a really good security system. You want to see what's going on within your building. You want to be able to manage access patterns to both the rooms in your building and the building itself. You want to ensure you have a really good security system to understand the behavior or activity that's taking place within the building that you've built. And so relating this to AWS resources, when you think about rooms in this building that you are creating for your environment, the AWS accounts are those rooms. So when you're building your environment through AWS, it's typically happening through multiple accounts. And again, we have to start here because I still talk to customers today who seem to be operating out of a single account. And what creating accounts does for you is it gives you natural isolation boundaries such that as you're adding users and applications and services, they're built in these isolated environments where users aren't making overriding changes with one another. If there's a security incident in one account, it doesn't naturally go to the other accounts. When you're providing access to a single account, it doesn't give access to other accounts. So you're, again, creating these isolated rooms for specific purposes within your environment, within the building that you're creating. Now, when it comes to putting the rooms in appropriate places, this is where organizational units come into play. So if you're familiar with AWS Organizations, within your organization, you can create organizational units, and they give a structure to your accounts. They're built for specific purposes, and your accounts are associated with those organizational units. And at the organizational unit level is typically where you're applying policies and controls and customizing your environment across all the accounts that you're managing within your organization. If you don't have an organization unit structure, this is what we recommend where most customers should start. Within your security organizational unit, you'll have accounts for your security team to manage security services. In your infrastructure organizational unit, you'll have networking services. You'll have accounts for some of the shared services that are used across your environments in your organization. You'll have a sandbox organizational unit, and that's typically where you want to have some budget limits in play, but you also want to have maybe not very many policies so that your developers can explore and try out new solutions without them being on network or without them having impact on the workloads area of your environment. And then the workloads organizational unit is where you're typically going to have most of your accounts as your environment grows. For new applications or services, you'll be adding additional accounts there. And you'll want to have sub-OUs to separate your development environments from your production environments. Now, if you haven't moved to multi-account yet, let me give you some tips on the best way in which you can do that. First, if you have a management account that also has workloads, I would recommend that you do not use that account for workloads where possible. And so if you have just a few accounts in your organization, but your management account is also the account that you created with AWS and you have a whole ton of legacy workloads, the easiest thing to do is create a new account outside of the organization, create an organization in that new account, and then migrate all of your accounts to that organization as member accounts. And that way, the management account, which is the administrative account that creates the organization, creates the accounts and policies, it will only be used for that purpose, and then all of your users and developers and workloads will be somewhere separate. We highly recommend you isolate the management account where possible. And then if you just don't have the practice of starting new workloads and new accounts, just start somewhere. If you continue to build additional applications and services within a single legacy account that just happens to be there, get in the habit of creating a new account for new applications and services. Build that backbone or build that pattern so that you and your users can get used to the idea that when I'm building this new application, I need a new room, I need a new space for it to grow, and I want to do that within a separate account so that it can have its own space. And then you'll get used to that whole multi-account management feeling that comes into play as you're adopting new accounts. Again, you want to limit users in the management account. We'll talk about some tools and features and services to do that later on. If you're familiar with RAM or other resource sharing capabilities, you can use other accounts as ingress points. Like if you have this large legacy account that just hosts everything for whatever reason, you can use other accounts and RAM and other resource sharing capabilities as ingress points to the resources that you need within that account. So get familiar with RAM and other resource sharing capabilities, and that will allow you to effectively use multiple accounts without having to touch maybe a large legacy account. And then when it comes to using organizations, we do recommend having a single production organization, and that's because all the governance that you're putting in play, all the visibility that you have, is going to be at that organizational level. So if you want to manage it centrally, try to maintain all of your production accounts within a single production organization. You may have a separate test organization where you're making changes, where you're testing changes, you're testing some high-level policies. You're ensuring that you understand what's going to happen in your production organization with those changes. But in the sense of sprawling across multiple organizations for various reasons, you're going to lose that ability to manage effectively policies or centralized views or centralized security findings if you're operating across multiple different organizations, because the organization itself is a strong security boundary that you want to build around. So we do recommend where possible using a single production organization for your environment. And the reason why, as I mentioned, is there's a whole host of services that are built on AWS to recognize your organization. We're going to go through a number of them today. I don't list out the 30 or 40 services that you can utilize, but there's a number of different services across these different categories of managing accounts and resources, centralizing your security findings, optimizing your costs. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. But they are built to recognize your organization, and they're built to allow you to customize the service across your organization. When it comes to managing services in your organization, you typically need to turn on the organization setting for that particular service. Again, this is done in the management account. And then we recommend that you register a delegated administrator account. Now, this is a member account within the organization that can be used by your security team, your ops team, whoever's managing that particular service. And it allows them to see the information about your organization and manage that service on behalf of the management account. So essentially, the management account is giving the permissions to this member account to manage, say, guard duty for security findings. They can then view the organization and manage it from their own member account without having access to the management account. And that is something we highly recommend for any service that supports it. So let's review real quick. We've talked about building our building and that these rooms are accounts. We've talked about the blueprints for structure and why that's important. Let's take a deeper dive on the security system and talk about how you can build that into your governance environment.
So I'm sure you've seen this theme repeated through several sessions. Security is always a top priority here at AWS, and it's always a part of everything that we do. And it's the same with multi-account environments. And we broke it down into 3 areas: access management, visibility and monitoring, and controls. Andrew is actually going to dive a little deeper into controls, but we'll start with access management. In your organization, whether you're a startup or enterprise, you will have multiple users and multiple teams, and each of these teams and users will have different kinds of permissions depending on their activities and what workloads or even data they're working with. And so what this means then is that when you're working in a multi-account environment, the users and groups will need access to different accounts. And then third, it's also very important to continually audit the application of permissions across your users and groups. And the reason for this is that users and teams may change. Users may move from one team to another, or even the application gets updated. It may no longer need access to a particular data set. And so to do this, we have AWS IAM Identity Center. IAM Identity Center gives you access to accounts and applications from a single central location. And you can actually integrate it with one of your own existing identity sources. So we actually see customers using Okta, JumpCloud, CyberCloud, and more, and integrating it with Identity Center. The reason why this is helpful is that if you have existing users and groups, this can sync with IAM Identity Center, and when they log into AWS, they get that single AWS interface and then can access their specific accounts. And here's just an image of Identity Center. You can see that it's quite simple to select several accounts and apply it to individuals and groups. You can also add your own customer-managed policies. There's a limit of 10 policies. This includes both AWS and customer-managed policies. Now, in the past, and this is something new, but in the past, a lot of our customers, due to regulation and policies, were often implementing MFA on their root users whenever they created accounts. This was time-consuming because you had to manually retrieve the root user credentials for new accounts and then apply MFA. But we just launched Root Access Management. And with this feature, you can actually enable it from IAM and review the state of root users across your entire multi-account environment. And so if you don't need the root user credentials, you can actually delete it. There's also some other functionality with the root user access management console where you can take privileged actions on S3 policies as well as SQS policies. And here's just a picture of root access management. You enable it from IAM. And just like Andrew mentioned, we do recommend using a delegated administrator account for it as well. And here's another image where you can take a privileged action on a member account. You can see that it has two actions, one for S3 policies and one for SQS queue policies. And then from there, you can also delete the root user credentials. So this is going to be a very powerful feature and should save you time versus in the past where you actually had to retrieve the root user credentials and apply MFA. Now, the last part of access management is that we also recommend that you continually audit the permissions for your users and roles. And this will help you identify unused passwords, access keys, roles, as well as services. And you want to do this because if you have production accounts with multiple teams and users, you want to avoid excessive permissions. It's just a best practice. And then we come to our second part. That was access management. The second part is all about visibility and monitoring. And as a best practice, we recommend centralized logging because this will allow you to bring your logs from other sources. This includes applications, other accounts, as well as possibly reviewing the permissions of your data within your accounts. And that's actually a very critical activity that we've seen with some of our customers where they're always constantly reviewing who has access to particular data sets. And then when you centralize your logs, this also allows your organization to implement some standardization and consistency to how your logs are received. You can ensure that your logs have proper retention policies and are immutable. That means that they are always available and unchanged. And with AWS CloudTrail, again, one of our services, we do recommend that you set it up with AWS Organizations because whenever you have a new account, CloudTrail will automatically get enabled for the new account and the logs will be fed into a centralized log bucket. On a control tower environment, you actually have two options, but by default, the recommendation is to use CloudTrail with AWS Organizations. And in Control Tower, it's all centralized within the log archive bucket. And then from there, you can go ahead and analyze the findings. Then on security monitoring tools, it's important to have some kind of visibility across your multi-account environment on findings, risks, and just assessments that are taking place across your environment. And we need to have tools that can help with continuous monitoring. And the two tools that are extremely key are Security Hub and GuardDuty. AWS Security Hub, you can think of it as our cloud security posture management tool. It simply aggregates all of the findings and reports into a centralized dashboard. It's built, you can actually enable certain security frameworks. All of these security framework controls are managed by AWS, and a lot of them are built on AWS Config. The nice thing about Security Hub, too, is that if you are using a third-party security tool, maybe CrowdStrike, Alert Logic, or so, you can integrate those findings into this tool. And then the second security tool that we recommend implementing across your multi-account environment is AWS GuardDuty. And GuardDuty will review the data from 3 key data sources. This includes CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, and your Route 53 DNS query entries. And it's also very well integrated with AWS Organizations. And here's another image of Security Hub. But as you can see, it gives you that dashboard of resources, accounts, and applications. Very useful to receive an aggregate view of your findings. Now, controls.
Right, so we've talked about having visibility within your security system, which is hugely important. Now we want to talk about what actions you can take to help implement controls within your environment, to help dictate the behavior of your users, help them learn about the correct behaviors, and help you identify potential issues and take remediation actions with them. And again, when you think about controls, you want to think about the structure in which you're putting these controls, which is your organization. In this example, we have a few organizational units here, and I outlined the workloads organizational units. These are broad rules that help you to customize your environment. They help you define approved actions for your environment, approved access policies, et cetera. You are using controls to help customize areas within your organization for specific purposes. You want to always start broad and then refine as you get to further levels of the organization. And that's because whenever you're applying controls at higher levels of organizational units, they are flowing through to all the other nested organizational units below them. So again, you can set broad level controls, say at the workloads OU level, and then you can set more that impact all the accounts, whether dev or prod, no matter where they are. And then let's say within your production environment, you want to put on some more specific lockdown protocols. You can modify or adjust or add additional policies there to protect that production environment. And as an example, there's a backup policy that allows you to dictate how frequent backups need to take place. Maybe within your organization, you don't need to do it as much as you need to do within your production environment, because in your production environment, the data is always changing, and maybe that needs to happen more frequently. So you can, again, create these policies to dictate the different behaviors within different areas in your organization. Now, there's 2 broad types of organization policies, and we're going to talk about 2 specific new policies that have been released within the last month that you may want to pay attention to. So there's authorization policies, and if you're familiar with IAM and identity and access management world, where you have all the policies that allow people to access things and allow things to be accessed, there's 2 different authorization policies types: service control policies, which has been around for a long time, and then what has been launched this year is resource control policies, which we'll dive into in a sec. And then there's management policies, and these are policies that dictate the behavior of services within your organization. So we talked about backup as an example. You can have backup policies within your environment, tag policies, AI opt-out policies. Recently in October, there's new chatbot policies that have been released to help you manage accounts in the different chat applications that you use, like Slack and others. And then declarative policies for EC2, and those are specific policies to help you manage EC2 service configuration settings at scale. So there's another type of control that we'll start with, which is detective controls, and this has been around for a long time. If you're familiar with config, what it can help you do is identify resources within your organization, within your accounts and your environment, and you can set up specific rules that will alert you when a resource configuration breaks that particular rule. Public access is one that's very common. And so these are rules that they can run periodically, or they can run every time an operation is taken, so it can double check and ensure that the resource configurations are accurate. And then when it finds rules, you can set up automations to automatically remediate that particular issue. So AWS Config has a rule that's there, it gets triggered, you can use Systems Manager and build some automations in play to help go fix that particular configuration, and then in this instance, your EC2 instance doesn't have a public IP association after you run that automation. Now, it's not uncommon when we talk about config rules that customers will say, that's great, but wouldn't it be nice if we could just prevent that behavior in the first place? Like, I don't necessarily need a rule to tell me to make the change and to alert me to go take an action. Why can't I just ensure that that action doesn't actually get into production in the first place? And so that is where I want to discuss a little bit more about the declarative policies that have been released. They help you ensure configuration is always maintained on a particular service. And again, in the same way that you can apply policies across your organization, you can apply and create specific custom declarative policies across your organization. And how this works is within this particular example, let's say that you want to block the public sharing of snapshots within your organization. You can create a declarative policy that doesn't allow them to be created in the first place. So this is happening within EC2. You can create a setting that says block all the public sharing for these EBS snapshots. And then wherever you apply within your organization, in this example, it's been within an organizational unit, all of the accounts that are in there, are not able to create those particular instances with those configuration details. These are the supported actions that have come with declarative policies right at launch. This list will grow as time goes on, but these are the ones you want to pay attention to and test out within your environments. I think many of them are common use cases across developers and across organizations in terms of what customers want to tell us for resource and service configurations. So this list will only grow over time. You're familiar with SCPs, I hope. They've been around for a long time. If you're not familiar, SCPs specifically dictate rules around the actions or the APIs that users can use within your particular environment. Again, you can apply them to your entire organization, and you can refine them as you get down to the account level and applying those service control policies. In this particular example, you're blocking the ability for someone to change the public access settings of an S3 bucket. And then if you're familiar with Control Tower, these are called preventative guardrails within that particular environment. But I want to talk about the resource permission side of things, because service control policies have been around for a while, and there's a whole host of literature and guidance in other sessions that you can look at to get better SCP access pattern recommendations from AWS. But I want to talk about resources because that's the other side of IAM, where you want to ensure that only the right people have access to the resources that are being created. There's resource policies that are happening across your organization. And typically in the past, you've always had best intentions of ensuring your developers use the right resource permissions. Like if you don't want your resources to be accessed from outside the organization, they would have to ensure that these lines of code were in their resource policy for the buckets that were created. So there's a much better way of doing that nowadays with resource control policies. In the same way that SCPs are specifically dictating permissions for APIs and actions that users can take, resource control policies are working on the resource policies within the resources in your environment. So the access patterns that you create in terms of who can access what resources, these resource control policies are set at the organization level or at the organizational unit level to help you ensure that no matter what access configurations are in the resource policies that your users create, these will override them and be organization controls that you can put in play. So this is another thing that there are other sessions that dive deeper into this, and I highly recommend looking into them. Be aware of the services that support RCPs at launch. This list will grow, again, as time goes on, and it's something to sort of test out within your own environments. So just to, again, keep all the policies straight, when you're creating service control policies, they're being enforced on principals or users trying to take actions. When you're creating resource control policies, you're creating consistent access controls on resources at scale. So a good example of that is ensure that no one can access this resource from outside of my organization. And then declarative policies, again, are service configurations that you can set and customize at scale within your organization. And if you use Control Tower, it's ideal because you have all these guardrails that are built within Control Tower, and you can apply these new controls in place. So there's a number of new controls that have been added to Control Tower that are based on these new policy types that have been launched within the last month or two. If you don't use Control Tower, you can always lean on Control Tower for guidance. So there's documentation that help outline what controls are being used within Control Tower, and you can recreate those controls within your own environment as well. So if you're not sure where to start with RCPs, with the declarative policies and these new policy types, look into Control Tower and their documentation, see what examples they have, and see if you can apply them within your own environments as well.
Okay. So just rounding off a few different things. So we covered multi-account, we covered security. The next is inventory management. And it's all about understanding what resources you're running within your multi-account environment. We often hear from customers about questions like, we launched an instance about 6 months, 8 months ago, but I don't remember which region it is, or maybe there's some kind of compliance or audit request that's taking place. Sometimes we also hear from security teams that they need to keep track of an IP address. There were certain strange requests that were coming in from an instance, but it occurred months ago. We need to understand when and why it occurred. Or other times, it's about understanding what resources are tagged or are not tagged. And this becomes very complicated when you have a lot of accounts, and those accounts continue to grow within your environment. The other challenge is that sometimes our customers are very interested in understanding the relationships between resources in an application. You may have EC2 instances that need to connect to networking resources, could be VPCs, security groups, as well as understand what security controls are applied to that application. How can you do this from an aggregated point of view? So the two services that help with this are AWS Resource Explorer and AWS Config. And if you remember, Andrew spoke about AWS Config, but he spoke about it from a rules standpoint. Here in this case, we actually use Config for inventory management. And with Amazon Resource Explorer, it's actually a very good initial step where it gives you a simplified dashboard of the list of resources across your accounts and regions. You can use it to understand what resources are tagged as well as untagged, or if you're searching for a particular ARN of a resource, you can simply enter it into Resource Explorer and it will identify it for you. Config takes it a step further. It actually gives you the resource configuration details. And that's how you can tell what relationships the resource has. And then it also stores the detailed configuration history. So it's a very powerful compliance tool. Now, sometimes we also hear our customers ask us, how can we just get a list of resources and the configuration of the resources across the entire environment? And to do that, Config does support an API, so you can take a point-in-time capture of the configurations and feed it into an S3 bucket. And something else I didn't talk about with Config is that you can actually run queries on the config data. It supports a natural language querying function. But if you need something that's a little bit more sophisticated than that, you can run join SQL queries using its Python and API functionality. And here's an image of Resource Explorer. As you can see, it includes a variety of query templates. And you can list out untagged resources as well as what resources are not within an application object, and so on. And then with Config, again, on the perspective of having dashboards and proper monitoring, it will give you information on the summary of compliant as well as non-compliant resources across your entire environment. And you can use config aggregators, as many as you want. Okay. Managing costs.
All right, this is this last bit before we're going to get to Colm here, because I definitely want to hear about how he's managing governance within his environment, and this will be very quick. So when it comes to your sprawling environment, as you're adding accounts, as you're putting security protocols in play and ensuring your access management is buttoned down, the next concern that is going to come into play is managing the cost within your growing environment. And we talk to customers a lot about this, and I think there's 3 key principles that apply that are useful for any customer trying to manage this, which is ensuring you have visibility of those costs, ensuring you know why it goes up, why it goes down, and having all that detail at the ready, and also ensuring that you give your teams that visibility as well. Ensure that they are responsible for their costs and generating cost reports to help them identify where they can be more efficient. Once you have visibility, you're able to optimize the costs that you have. You can identify areas where you want to optimize the costs across your environment or encourage your teams to do so. And then you can even go back and use the controls that we've talked about and create preventative mechanisms to ensure high-cost actions aren't taken within your environment, or they're only taken within a specific part of your environment where you're auditing, you're reviewing it, and you know that only users who should take those actions can do so. And so creating cost dashboards with automated insights, cost and usage reports, and QuickSight will be your friends here. Again, you will have to do a lot of customization to build the cost reports that will be aligned to the teams that need to be aware of them. But you can utilize these tools to create those reports and ensure that your teams have the visibility of their particular costs and then can help optimize them as well. There's 3 specific services that work across your organization and help you optimize costs for compute, for storage, and then just general cost optimization requirements. Compute Optimizer, Storage Lens, and Cost Optimization Hub. This is an example of what you might see in Compute Optimizer, which is you're using resources across many accounts within your organization. You're using instances, and they may or may not be over-provisioned or under-provisioned. This can give you some guidance on where you should spend your time in helping to improve your costs and your utilization of your compute instances. If you're using S3 Storage Lens, this is what their tool looks like, and it's very similar. Again, it allows you to view the S3 resources that are being used across your entire organization, and it can give you ideas of where you might be able to find some cost optimization behaviors that you can take by, again, moving storage to different storage types where it may not be utilized effectively. And then within Cost Optimization Hub, it takes findings from Compute Optimizer, it takes findings from S3 Storage Lens, and it gives you additional insights, and it gives you additional recommendations for, say, RISP sharing or RISP creations or aggregations or services that you can use. And I'd love to turn the time over for Colm so we can hear from Workday.
Thanks, Andrew. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Bear with me. So just to reintroduce myself, my name is Colm Usher. I lead the public cloud security team for Workday. And just for some context, Workday are a leading provider of cloud-based enterprise applications for financial management, human resources, and analytics. So what I'm going to try and do over the next kind of 15 minutes is bring you on a journey from where Workday were a couple of years back, what that infrastructure looked like, to where we currently are now. So back in 2019, 5 years ago, Workday are a single AWS organization. We have organizational units which we categorize by tier, and a tier gives us a determination of what type of workload is running in that environment. Is it dev, is it production, non-production? Now we do operate a multi-account model because we feel the account serves as a really good boundary. And for the most part, services are configured independently. Again, this is 2019. CloudTrail and Config are configured at account provisioning because these predate organizational support. So at this point in time, 2019, we're operating about 175 member accounts. So incremental change over the next 2 years up until 2021, we start adding some native services to improve the overall security posture. We start with service control policies. We go with the enforcement model for allow everything except what we deny. And we start small. We look at policies which are unlikely to impact teams at scale. So things like protecting CloudTrail from disablement, modification to AWS Config, preventing accounts from leaving the organization, or protecting your kind of core security roles and policies. So sometimes change is forced upon us. Along comes Log4j in 2021. So we had to adapt pretty quickly. So we began with centralizing event log collection for guard duty, access analyzer, piping that back into Security Hub. So then we had a central collection point for streaming findings over to our security information event management system. So we also start to leverage organizations a lot more, specifically delegated administrators. By using the delegated admin, that gives us the ability to take service management outside of the payer account. At this point in time, we're still a single organization. Member accounts are still grouped by tier classification, but we have expanded on a number of security services. So just to kind of walk you through what Security Hub looks like for us. And so we start with a delegated administrator back to a central security monitoring account. And we configure the native service integrations into Security Hub. So the likes of guard duty, firewall manager, inspector, IAM. We take those back into a dedicated single region for aggregation of findings, and then we start a leverage Event Bridge and Data Firehose, or formerly Kinesis. That gives us a stream out to our Security Information Event Management System. At this point, we are now at 300 member accounts. And for the math, that's an additional 125 in the 2 years. So change management. Companies mature, the risk appetite changes, and stricter change control procedures develop. So we realized that in order to carefully test any change in a production organization, we would feel more comfortable that change has already been tested in a replica org. So we make a decision that for every AWS production organization we have to maintain a replica, which is configured in the exact same way. So that's any changes across SCPs, guard duty, Security Hub, if it's protection plans in guard duty, CloudFormation stack sets, anything that would normally be applied at the organizational level must first go through a replica org. So even though we do have development environments in a production org, it would still be a change to a production service. We also started to increase the amount of SCPs we had, so preventing billing modifications to protect alternative methods of authentication for root access, securing Terraform backend, denying root user access, and also all of these additional services we've now putting in SCPs to protect those APIs. So change gets implemented in a replica org, standard functional testing takes place, goes through soak time, that varies depending on what the change is, and then it moves to production. And by moving to production, it moves to the production org under a development tier. Once that change is in a development tier, it goes through the same process of functional testing, soak time, before iterating up through additional higher classification tiers. So, bear with me. That brings us on to kind of last year. We're now at 470 member accounts. At that time, we had a business need to allow a specific team to be able to dynamically create AWS accounts on demand. Even provisioning multiple accounts in advance wouldn't have satisfied that use case. Our existing account creation process, whilst it was very well defined, it could be considered slow, could take days to weeks in order to have an account provisioned in order to get through finance and security. So between, that's our problem statement if you want to read, but between Workday's infrastructure, our security, finance, and dev teams, we needed to architect a solution which would meet the risks and requirements of those teams. So working directly with the AWS solution architects with our requirements, the first requirement being that this was better off dedicated in its own organization. We knew we wanted to bring the good things from our other production orgs like SCPs and guard duty, CloudTrail, and Config, but maybe take advantage of some of the newer services which are more difficult to integrate into a pre-existing organization. So we start with a dedicated AWS organization. This gives us a really good boundary to isolate the environment. We let AWS Control Tower manage the environment. So that sets up the landing zone, gives us multi-account best practices, centralized identity and access management. And it also has dedicated management accounts for centralized log management and security auditing. We leverage Account Factory and have CloudFormation lay down a secure baseline for member accounts. And we knew we wanted centralized management of access permissions across multiple accounts, and we achieved that through AWS Identity Center. That simplified user access control, making it easier to apply consistent security policies and reduce administrative overhead. And when we had that done, the first thing we did was create a replica organization mirrored for the production org. So any changes go through that same life cycle again. That kind of brings us up to kind of present day where we're bordering 800 accounts and probably online to pass 1,000 in 2025. So what I want to kind of finish off on is some practical tips that myself and my team have kind of learned along the way. Some are security focused, some are cost focused. So we're going to start with AWS CloudTrail. So if you are leveraging a centralized security trail, the first copy of management events in that region are delivered free of charge. If you create additional trails for those same management events, it will incur a CloudTrail cost. S3 read and write events, if you have that enabled on CloudTrail, I would keep an eye on get object, delete object, and put object API calls. What we have seen in the past is teams that are heavily utilizing S3 that can generate significant CloudTrail spend. And then encryption with a customer managed encryption key. Again, if you're taking CloudTrail logs back to a central S3 bucket, that means that your member accounts only have access to 90 days of activity locally. So if teams are looking for access to that CloudTrail event past that, most common use case is where they're trying to generate IAM policies based on CloudTrail events. It's better to use the customer managed encryption key. It allows you to modify the KMS resource policy for cross-account access. So we'll go on to AWS Config. The aggregator and advanced queries, really good if you haven't leveraged them. Fantastic service to very quickly query resources across the org. Rather than having to scrape data resources from each individual account, which we used to do with the likes of Lambda, you encounter timeouts. This returns in seconds. There are some limitations. Once you go into the advanced queries section, you will see that URL link at the top, but it has them well documented. And for cost, if you are using a config recorder, the cost for the aggregators and advanced queries does not incur any additional cost. AWS Organizations. So if you have or are planning a mix of commercial and government organizations, I strongly recommend considering separate orgs. Much easier to manage service boundaries. Also to note, if you do create replica organizations, you may not benefit from the enterprise discount program or savings plans for resources operating in that org. And again, don't forget to have strong controls in your delegated admin accounts. In relation to SCPs, maximum size of an SCP document is just over 5,000 characters. You can consider grouping similar blocks together or create separate policies. Watch out for removing the AWS full access policy. It presents itself as being inherited and directly applied within the organizational unit. If you remove it, it switches the mode of operations to deny everything except what you allow. Consider monitoring for access denied API events where SCPs are in force. So essentially, if you're adding an API into an SCP policy, you might want to know if something is trying to trigger that. So it might indicate account compromise or maybe just a misconfigured automation. In relation to AWS Security Hub, again, setting up the delegated administrator and cross-region aggregation, then configuring integrations from the likes of GuardDuty, Firewall Manager, etc. You then have a single pipe for all your findings. Automatic response. So Security Hub does have this ability to automatically address security threats with predefined responses. What I would say is if you take that in, if you start to adopt that, you might cause configuration drift for your service teams if they are maintaining using Terraform. And scaling, two really good features, automatically enabling new regions and auto-enable new accounts. GuardDuty. Runtime monitoring, really good protection plan, but just again, this relates back to like Security Hub. If you enable this, you might cause configuration drift for member accounts if they're maintaining state because it lays down a VPC endpoint. And threat list, you can supplement GuardDuty with up to 6 threat lists, external third-party threat lists per account per region. And in relation to Amazon S3, so S3 Storage Lens, really nice feature to give you organizational-wide visibility of S3 into, let's say, where encryption has been used, what storage has been used. What we discovered is by far the highest percentage, standard tier is what the teams tend to gravitate towards, and that is the most expensive tier. S3 account level blocking, really good feature. If you're using it, I'd recommend protecting with an SCP so that only specific principals can make modifications to that feature. And server access logs. Again, it's kind of a compliance thing to enable, but if you do enable server access logging on an S3 bucket, Don't enable it on that destination bucket. It causes an infinite loop of logs. And that brings us to Control Tower. So ClickUps. If you're implementing Control Tower, just remember all changes should go through Control Tower. Otherwise, landing zone is going to detect drift and won't work until it's repaired. Landing zone plan, again, don't rush through the landing zone setup process without fully considering the structure and organization of accounts and organizational units. And guardrails. There's a lot of pre-built guardrails within Control Tower. Carefully consider each of these and the impact within your organization. That brings us up to AWS IAM and route management. Andrew, I think, or Navas would have talked on the recent new feature for route management. This kind of is a separate area, and this goes around protecting the alternative methods of authentication. So if you lose a root credential and you need to do a password reset, that basically relies on access to the D list for the account and the ability to modify the phone number or take a call. So that this SCP protects who can modify the phone number on the account. Attribution, keeping an accurate database, inventory of all your accounts, absolutely critical. Who maintains the account, who approves spend, where to send alerts to. Aim to have that database dynamically updated at account provisioning and offboarding. You can leverage tags on the account level within organizations itself. And just lastly, this is more of a security-focused thing. Confused deputy attack, not many people will have come across, but if you haven't, it's a vulnerability that can affect both identity-based policies and resource-based policies, most common with cross-account or cross-service roles. And I think that is it for me.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great to hear about all of the tips and recommendations. So I'm going to bring this to conclusion, and just to review everything that we talked about. Solidify your structure. Starts with the multi-account environment. Think about the accounts, the policy, common policy groupings. Use the integrated services, CloudTrail, GuardDuty, Security Hub. Adopt controls. Think about the new RCPs, the declarative policies, preventive controls, detective controls with AWS Config. And then review the resources across your multi-account environment. And you can use tools like Resource Explorer and Config. And then we were really lucky to have Colm come in and talk to us about the governance journey from Workday. Thank you very much, everyone.